Freedom of speech and expression is a fundamental right for all, protected through Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." Media groups say it is not enough, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hello, I'm Dimyake Mwakalyelye, and this is Our Voices. World Press Freedom Day this year is being observed under the theme Information as a Public Good. The annual Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders reveals that of the 180 countries it evaluated for press freedom practices, only 12 can claim to have a favorable journalism environment. Eritrea ranks last in the 180 index, having dropped 2 places, while Burundi, Sierra Leone, and Mali have shown improvements. The report also noted that while Africa continues to be the most violent continent for journalists, abuses against journalists has declined. To begin our show, we go back to that day in 1991 when African print journalists who had gathered in Namibia for a media conference co-organized by UNESCO came up with the Windhoek Declaration, which pushed for the recognition by governments of a free, independent, and pluralistic press. Gwen, co-chair of the Namibian Trust, which publishes the Namibian newspaper, co-chaired that historic seminar with the now late editor of Le Messenger, Pius Njawe of Cameroon. I spoke with Ms. Lister via Skype from Namibia.
In 1991, that a group of African journalists assembled for the first time from across the continent, some of whom had to be released from jail to attend the seminar in Windhoek. And we got together really to affirm the importance of independent, free, of course, and pluralistic press on the continent. I think it must be borne in mind that 1991 was just after the Cold War era had ended. Namibia had become free the year before, and so it had come out into the world and into Africa in particular with a constitution which gave which had a Bill of Rights, which obviously included press freedom. If we remember at the time also, South Africa was just emerging from the apartheid era. They weren't entirely free as yet. Most governments on the continent were controlling both the print media and the radio.
So 30 years now into the declaration, the formation of World Press Freedom Day. And the theme this year, Information for Public Good. Your reflections on when it started, where we are now, and in between.
Press freedom is often, I say, a 1 step forward, 2 steps back approach. So democracy also on the continent is very fragile. Namibia, it's just been announced today, continues to hold the top spot in the World Press Freedom Rankings, which have been released by the Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a rather nice thing to happen, especially as we host this World Press Freedom Day. But I think further than that, the declaration obviously also led to a very significant historical moment for journalists globally, and that was when the UN General Assembly declared May 3, the day of the Windhoek Declaration adoption, as World Press Freedom Day. Further afield, it was followed by similar declarations in other parts of the world, where journalists around the world began to affirm that they wanted their journalistic independence and freedom, and they didn't want the government controls to continue. It did, in the declaration itself, encourage, for example, African broadcasters to together and to determine their own way forward. And that happened exactly 10 years after the adoption of the Windhoek Declaration, where journalists, radio journalists from across the continent adopted the African Charter on Broadcasting. And of course, the Windhoek Declaration had also paved the way, I think, for the opening up of the airwaves in Africa, which was very significant for the people of the continent.
The 180th country, which is all the countries that it considers in terms of press freedoms, is the worst rated is also in Africa, Eritrea. 180th. So when you look at that spectrum, what is your assessment of why, press freedom is still a real challenge to achieve across the board on the continent?
It's a struggle that's never entirely won. And I mean, if I think of it, was it 2019? We had World Press Freedom Day in Ethiopia, and it was a really good time. The journalists were released from jail shortly afterwards, and it looked like Ethiopia was turning a corner. And now, of course, we look at things and the situation has regressed quite badly. So yes, there's this huge spectrum on the continent of some countries which are very good about press freedom, and Ghana is also one of the countries that stands out. And then the absolute worst case scenarios like Eritrea, as you've mentioned, which is such a closed country that we know so little about what is actually happening there. And kind of speaks to me to the lack of political will, if you like, on the part of the African Union and African governments to actually not just pay lip service.
Why do you think there's such contention between journalists and governments? What is at the core of it that you can reflect on?
It can be a healthy tension. It can be the kind of tension where the journalists speak out and sometimes the politicians respond. And that's not a bad thing. After all, it's their democratic right and freedom of expression to do that as well. So one doesn't want to sweat the small stuff, as they say. It's difficult to say what causes this break, if you like, between media and the government. But it does seem that there's certainly some governments that just want to control and have all the power and want it to continue and don't want to have the critical or probing eye of the media looking at things like corruption or mismanagement or bad governance and things like that.
Public's trust in the media. There are varying reports that indicate that sometimes the public does not trust the media. What are your thoughts on that?
If I think it's probably one of the most critical issues there is right now for journalists to face and to discuss, that would be it. More and more people sort of going on social media like Facebook, like Twitter and others, and causing them to turn away from real news, news that makes a difference in their own lives as citizens. Now that the media spectrum has opened up in a lot of countries, it's obviously brought different ownership patterns into play. And there are people with agendas who are running the media in various countries. And again, journalists need to really get a handle on, because it's also so critical for the sustainability of what we call legacy or traditional media.
Among the positives in the fight for press freedom, Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan is reopening media outlets that were closed or otherwise repressed under the late President John Magufuli. Hassan ordered responsible authorities to lift a ban on all media outlets and ordered officials to follow government guidelines, adding, "Let us not give them a chance to say that we are limiting press freedom." Despite the progress, the number of journalists jailed for their work hit a record high in 2020, with 273 imprisoned globally, according to the annual survey by the Committee to Protect Journalists. For more on this, I spoke with Muthoki Mumo, CPJ's Sub-Saharan Africa representative, via Skype from Kenya.
Every year, CPJ publishes what we call our annual prison census. It's a survey that looks at journalists who are in jail on December 1 every year around the world. Unfortunately, last year in 2020, the number was at a historic high, 274 globally. In Sub-Saharan Africa, that number was 45 journalists behind bars as at December 1. Of those 45 journalists, 2 were women, 2 Burundian women. Such figures do not present the full picture, because women working out in the field face unique challenges that their men counterparts may not face. So, for instance, in my own research, talking to journalists who cover politics, most recently in Uganda, you hear women talking about the societal expectations on them and what that means about their ability to go out in the field for weeks on end following political campaigns. Can they do that? Will they be allowed to do that, not just by their editors, but also by their families? Recently, women in Somalia were also, around International Women's Day, were also speaking out about this stigma associated with their profession. Online harassment, unfortunately, has risen as a huge challenge for all journalists across the world, covering, specific beats like politics or gender or corruption. And unfortunately, a trend that we're seeing increasingly is that women are targeted by particularly vitriolic and gendered attacks online. During the South African election, which wasn't last year, it was in 2019, we spoke to South African women who spoke about being doxxed, being targeted by trolls and bots for, very gendered insults, having politicians sick their followers against them, essentially. Sexual harassment. Unfortunately, this is women are particularly vulnerable to this. It can lead women to decide, no, I'm not going to go cover that story. I'm going to stick to this place where I think I'm going to be safe from harassment. It can lead women to leave newsrooms entirely. And what happens when this happens? What are the consequences of this? Is that we have very important voices that we should be having in our newspapers and on our TV being taken away. The diversity of the voices that we listen to.
Obviously, the face of journalism has changed a lot. How do you establish and distinguish between the kinds of journalists that are out there, and how does CPJ assist?
As CPJ, we have taken a deliberate decision not to be in the job of defining journalists, because we operate in so many different countries, but because we've also seen that narrow definitions of who a journalist is can be weaponized to again erode the kind of information that is allowed to make it to the public sphere. Rather, what we deal with is people who are, or the people we try to defend is people who are committing acts of journalism, as we say. So these could be columnists, these could be people who use their public Facebook pages to tell the stories of their communities and what their communities are going through, or to share opinions about what is going on in their own countries. If you look in different countries and different places, particularly where access to mainstream media is not as easy, these are avenues where people are doing very good reporting about their communities and speaking out about injustices. The reason why it's so important, particularly at this moment, to cast this net widely is because we've seen an unfortunate trend in several sub-Saharan African countries where attempts to define what is journalism, attempts to license journalists are being weaponized. A couple of them come to mind during the Ugandan election in last year, for instance. In Tanzania, for instance, you need to have a license to run a YouTube channel, which of course acts as a way of locking out rather than opening up, so that we can hear from as many people as possible, so that this space does not become an elite space where only certain perspectives are allowed.
It's time for a quick break. When we come back, we look at another threat to female journalists, the coronavirus. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Our Voices on VOA. According to the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, COVID-19 has killed more than 3 million people. Countries had to take various measures to stop the spread of the deadly virus. Covering the pandemic came with risks and challenges, especially for women reporters, according to the Coalition of Women Journalists. VOA correspondent Mariama Diallo has that story.
The lockdown that began in March 2020 were key strategies used around the world to slow the spread of the coronavirus pandemic.
I think in the early March, we saw this complete sort of huge challenge where women journalists, especially freelancers, were facing this challenge of finding a job to be able to do.
As the pandemic took a toll on lives, governments took drastic measures, including closing borders and imposing quarantines to protect medical systems from being strained. But some of them also tried to control the storyline, she says.
We saw this in Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, some of these countries, China, Pakistan, some of these countries use the opportunity of COVID-19 into politicizing the issue and creating misinformation about journalists who had been trying to do their job.
In Turkey, journalist Ebru Kucukaydin was taken into custody after one of her coronavirus reports and later released. The Turkish government accused her of creating panic. Other journalists, Malaysia's award-winning Wan Nur Hayati and The Guardian's Cairo correspondent Ruth Michelson, faced charges or were expelled or harassed for their coverage of the pandemic, the coalition says. Last year, the International Federation of Journalists surveyed nearly 560 female reporters from 52 countries and found that stress increased for 77% since the pandemic began. Catherine Gicheru leads the Africa Women Journalism Project in Kenya, an initiative started by the International Center for Journalists. She's seen the negative effects the pandemic has had on some women journalists in countries where gender discrimination is widespread.
This I have reports also from the fellows in Tanzania and in Uganda as well as in Nigeria, is the fact that if you have to work from home, then you're the one who's also taking care of the family. And that's 2, 3, 4 times the job that she was, a woman journalist was previously doing. And that is across the board. So you have a mental anxiety, the stresses, the fears that everybody has, but much more for women, especially women journalists.
She also says women journalists have been hit with job losses.
The women, a lot of them, especially in Kenya, are either on contract terms or are freelancers. And the fact that they've lost they've either been laid off or they've been put on half pay, it means the situation has become even more difficult.
And she says it has had an impact on coverage of other women-related topics, including sexual health, obstetric fistula, and female genital mutilation. Mariama Diallo, WEWE News, Washington.
Noting the many challenges women journalists face, from harassment to lack of proper training to do their jobs well, Dr. Yemisi Akinbobola explained why she co-founded her organization, African Women in Media. She joined us via Skype from the United Kingdom.
First of all, we set up a learning management platform. And that funding allowed us to train 200 women journalists on this program so that we could deliver our training virtually at self-paced, because we also recognize that, women are at home and having the care responsibilities of looking after their family more than their male counterparts. But then because it was virtual, we had things like access to technology to contend with, right? Mm-hmm. So people not having access to data. We also did research on how COVID-19 impacted East African women journalists. 59% of our respondents said that they had been put on unpaid leave, right? That's a significant percentage. Some of those people put on unpaid leave were pregnant women. Sexual harassment changed. You're relying more on online sources on social media for your news gathering, and then again that opens you up to sexual harassment on social media, cyberbullying on social media. So those are some of the things that our research kind of found out, and one of our key recommendations is around gender policies.
Can you define gender policies? What kind of policies do you have in mind?
So we're talking about in your HR policy, in your policies that guides your human resources, in your policies that guides your media outputs, there should be some form of gender consciousness. There's got to be an organizational objective to really have that clear trajectory from entry to leadership, and also for it to come with equity.
When you do talk about African women in media and what it's doing for African journalists, how has that shaped coverage of women, and what changes do you see in terms of how a story is covered by women versus how it's covered by men, especially when it has to do with women?
In our 2018 conference, the focus of that conference was around women in politics, right, and the coverage of women in politics. The statistics in Nigeria shows that all the many millions of Nigerian women who are notable and influential in Nigeria how many profiles of Nigerian women are there on Wikipedia? 1,500, right? And generally, women make up only 17% of Wikipedia profiles. Okay, so there's general disproportionality there. And so one of the things that we did with Wikimedia was that we wanted to train more women editors of Wikipedia, because hopefully that would then translate to more women representation.
How does your organization address the plight of stringers and freelancers?
The objective of Stringers Africa is to connect freelance journalists in African countries. We invite newsrooms to the conference. We invite funders to the conference, and you have that opportunity to pitch and to get that exposure, that access that you need. We're currently developing the actual digital platform itself, and it's something that we hope to launch later this year, and particularly focusing on women. And again, like you said, it's about that economic empowerment, but that freedom, that flexibility.
How you, as a woman, a mother, an academia, a journalist, and a starter of so many things, is able to do what you do, and what would be your message to a lot of women who obviously juggle and struggle to juggle with the various roles that you're doing currently?
Is time management, number one. Number two is just do it, because oftentimes we wait for the right moment to do something, and there's never a right moment. So just do it the way you can in that moment, and continue to build and learn and progress from there. All the knowledge doesn't just come from you, it comes from your community as well. So you cannot be insular in terms of your thinking. You can have the vision, but you should always kind of learn from other people's experiences, invite other people in. Nobody's an island on their own, working together with other people. I'm a very open person, almost too open perhaps, but in that process you build networks, you get to learn from other people's perspectives. And I'm learning that we always have this voice in our head telling us not to do something. The fear, I still have the fear. I had the fear before coming to this interview, right? And it's just learning to use that fear for you. Learning that fear for me, when I'm scared, when I'm about to do something and I have fear, I feel as if it's because, one, I'm challenging myself, so I'm taking myself out of my comfort zone, which is a good thing, right? It's because I care about that thing, and I want it to be really successful. I would say, whatever your circumstances, whatever you want to do, just get started, just do it, and build on it as you go.
It's time for another quick break. When we come back, veteran journalist Shaka Ssali shares his thoughts on the importance of journalism as his illustrious career at the Voice of America comes to an end. Stay with us.
We're bringing women's voices to the conversation, and more than that, we're building a community of inclusion and empowerment.
Here in Kinshasa, campaigns to raise awareness against the spread of coronavirus are common, but getting that information to people who have no access to water, electricity, or money can be a challenge.
We are here at Kalerwe Market, Uganda, Kampala, where in this whole market, women are crying out for their situations to change.
For women, it will be better for us.
I think a big thing for me is just being able to say that when these protests are happening, does it turn around into policy?
Our kids are raped every single day.
This movement got the government to listen. It really was powerful because it showed what is possible when men and women band together and say enough is enough.
It's not necessary anymore to climb on a car. I can be in any place to cheer with the people.
Welcome back. You're watching Our Voices. After more than 25 years as host of VOA's Straight Talk Africa, Shaka Ssali is retiring. Known for his sharp wit and intellect, I asked Shaka, or the Kabali Kid as he describes himself, to tell us his journey and his secret to keeping his audience engaged and informed.
It reminded me of the young Shaka growing up in Kabali, interacting with movies, cinema. I sort of became infatuated with those sorts of characters, and eventually upgraded to the genre of James Bond. Yes, like somebody once said, when you talk about James Bond and you talk about the journalist, Shaka Ssali, they gather information, except that when it comes to sharing it, that's where they depart. And Shaka Ssali gathers information for the people, to expose the people, so that people can in fact become socially and politically conscious of their rights.
And you did this very effectively through this platform that drove everybody to their sets every Wednesday evening, depending on where in the country or in the world you were. Straight Talk Africa. What was your approach to interviewing? What was the ethics behind you doing what you did so well?
Three things in as far as journalism is concerned: research, research, and research. Straight Talk Africa, you have to be prepared. There is no way I could ever go in a studio to interact with a newsmaker without having walked myself through who this person, first of all, is, what has this person accomplished, and what makes this person tick. There are so many people, and we are talking about millions of people, who are invested in you, who have expectations in you. There are people, on the other hand, who actually depend on every word that comes out of your mouth. And so you have to be a responsible journalist.
What would the outgoing Kabale kid tell the incoming Kabale kid at the time he entered the Voice of America?
I remember being asked a question in 2000, just before I actually hosted my debut, Straight Talk Africa. It was George who asked me, Shaka, what will it take for you to consider yourself as a successful host of Straight Talk Africa? I remember telling George that if I could first and foremost succeed at remaining authentically Shaka Ssali, the kid from HABARI, southwestern Uganda, then I would have succeeded.
And that's where we end our show. I'm Demiake Mwakaliele. On behalf of my colleagues here on Our Voices and at the Voice of America, thank you for watching. Stay safe.
Habari zilizotufikia hivi punde.
GNM Cargo, kampuni ya usafirishaji wa mizigo kutoka China kuja Afrika Mashariki, inatimiza miaka 10 ya uaminifu kuhudumia wana Afrika Mashariki. Mwandishi wetu Minho ana taarifa zaidi.
Kama unavyoona, tuma pesa zako kwa wakala wako China. Kazi nyingine tuachie sisi GNM Cargo, tukupakilie mzigo, tukusafirishie kwa niaba yako, tukague kwa niaba yako kwa bei nafuu.
Kwa mawasiliano zaidi tupigie kupitia 0677 066 551. GNM Cargo, we voyage your dreams.